So I'd now like to welcome and to introduce our speakers to you, beginning with Professor Kunbing Xiao. Professor Xiao is an anthropologist and associate professor in the School of Anthropology and Sociology at Southwest Minju University in China. Her research interests include anthropology of food, tea and wine, sensory anthropology, and cultural heritage studies. She's currently a visiting scholar at Bordeaux Montaigne University, and her talk today, her presentation, is titled Branding Bohea into a Successful Commodity: the collection, screening, and allocation of knowledge along the value chain in the early tea trade. Take it away, Professor Xiao.
Okay. Let me share my screen. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yeah, all good.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Ramita. Thank you for the generous introduction and for inviting me to this conference. It is my great pleasure to be part of this fascinating global discussion about tea and its influences from the middle 17th century to the middle 19th century. My talk focuses on a very particular tea, Bohea, which was already mentioned several times in the previous presentations. From the middle 19th century to the middle 19th century, Bohea produced in China was the best-selling tea in the global tea market. However, what exactly was Bohea tea is still disputable. It is very hard to interpret what Bohea was, since its meaning was changing accordingly to the context. First, it is a word of the Minnan dialect spoken in the southern Fujian province in the second half of the 17th century. Minnan merchants played an important role in the tea export. The term Bohea first appeared in the Western world in 1696 in the Voyage of a Surat by John of Canton, where 3 kinds of tea are described: Bing, Songlo, and Bohea. The first 2 were green teas, only Bohea being a red tea. However, throughout the 18th century, Bohea's connotation is not constant. Sometimes it refers to a black tea from Bohea Hills, which was smoked by the panwood fire when processed, acquiring its specific smoky flavor. Sometimes it is used as the general name for black tea or Chinese tea. The picture is a specimen of Bohea collected by the Linnean Society I found online. We can see that its leaves are bigger than other teas, and indeed, Bohea tea did not require small tender leaves. So in a certain period, this word also referred to
Okay. Is this stuck for anyone else?
Yes, I was.
Yeah,
Yes.
I think she's okay, she's back. Hold on one second. I'm going to put her on again. Kunbing, you're on mute, please. Yeah, you're back
can you
now.
hear you now?
Yeah, I can hear you. You might have to share again.
Yes, I'm so sorry.
No, that's okay.
We lost about a couple of minutes, so if you want to backtrack.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the value chain of the early global tea trade shows that there were many different roles involved in tea production, tea transportation, and tea consumption. Accompanying the flow of Bohea tea, its corresponding knowledge also traveled, crossing the ocean to reach Western countries. Commodities like Bohea tea represent very complex social forms and distributions of knowledge, which, broadly speaking, can be of 2 sorts: One is the knowledge that goes into the production of the commodity, and the other is knowledge that goes into its proper consumption. Passing from Chinese to Western societies, Bohea's value chain could be broken into 4 stages. First, its production. It is about how the tea was processed in Bohea hills. And the second is the port sittings. I will mainly focus on Canton system period, which is from 1757 to 1842. And the third is the sea voyage, which includes loading, packing, and storing the tea on the ships. Fourth is the overseas consumption. My interest is about how Bohea tea was introduced and consumed in the West, especially by the British. As we can see from the map, Bohea Hills, now called Wuyi Shan or Wuyi Mountains, in the northern part of Fujian province in southeast China, are the origin of Bohea tea. This is the very impressive engraving of the Bohea Hills from a book published in 1843, depicting the Juchi River and its surrounding rock peaks and hills. Along the river bank are presented tea bushes and tea workers. If you visit the Bohea Hills today, you will see more or less the same landscape, but only rock tea is now produced in this area, which is nowadays a national scenic spot open to tourists. If you want to visit a black tea area nowadays called Lapsan Xiaozhong, you have to go northwest to the Tongmu Natural Reserve of Wuyi Mountains, some 60 kilometers upstream from the Juchi River. How did the Bohea Hills look like? And how was the black tea produced there more than 100 years ago? I will explore those issues from both the early Western explorers' perspective and from the local Chinese interpretation point of view. First, I would like to introduce some early Western explorers of the Bohea Hills and their contribution to Western consumers' understanding of Chinese tea in general and of Bohea in particular. The first one I would like to quote is Samuel Ball, who was the inspector of tea for the English East India Company in Canton from 1804 to 1826. I do not think he ever visited the Bohea Hills, but in his 1848 publication, An Account of the Cultivation and Manufacture of Tea in China, he described in detail Bohea, Leishan tea, Canton, Padre Xiaozhong, and other teas produced in this region. Samuel Ball's description of the procession method used to produce black tea, however, does not describe the current method for black tea, but the one used to process rock tea, as it appears from the text quoted below. It has already been observed that the process of bay is considered by the Chinese as a very important part of the manipulation of black tea. The instrument used for this purpose is a can of a basket called a bay long, about 2.5 feet in height and 1.5 in diameter, open at both ends, or rather a tubular piece of a basket. Bay literally means baking in Chinese, and the instrument he described is called the bay long, which literally means baking basket. Instead of being smoked over a panwood fire, rock tea is roasted over a fireplace with a charcoal fire. A picture on the left is an illustration of a Samuel's tea baking process, while the picture on the right shows a tea roasting process in a modern rock tea factory. They look exactly the same. A second Westerner I would like to introduce is a famous tea thief, Robert Fortune, who has already been mentioned several times in the previous 2 days. According to a map from Fortune's book, the Bohea Hills were relatively insignificant, while the green tea area north of it was marked as a district for the best tea. Robert Fortune was in China 4 times. On his second visit from 1848 to 1851, he disguised as a Chinese to visit Bohea Hills, the black tea area which were then closed to foreigners. The man in this colored picture is not Robert Fortune, but an Australian named George Morrison. But the image provides a glimpse of what Fortune strolling into the interior of China might have looked. One of Fortune's most significant discoveries in his travel to the Bohea Hills was that black tea and the green teas originated from the same variety of tea plants and simply resulted from different processing methods. Now let's shift to the local tea farmers' interpretation of the origin of the black tea. Bohea, the famous 18th century black tea appreciated in the Western world, is called Lapsang Xiaozhong nowadays, and is still smoked over pan wood fire. A picture on the right that I took in 2012 shows a smoking room for the Lapsang Xiaozhong, present black tea produced in Bohea Hills. The tea leaves are placed on the shelves inside the first floor room, and the smoke from the pan wood fire filters from the lower level. We still don't know how this unique smoked tea was invented. In the general history of the Qing dynasty published in the early 20th century, it is stated that in 1640, black teas, including Canton, Bohea, Xiaozhong, and Puki, were exported to Britain via the Netherlands. People in Wuyi always repeat the same story about its origin. One day, a troop of soldiers passed through the village of Tongmu in Wuyi Mountain during the tea harvest season. The tea workers had fled to the nearby mountains to hide, leaving unprocessed tea leaves on the floor of the factory in the rush. The soldiers were very tired, and the fresh leaves seemed soft, so they slept on them for one night before leaving early in the morning. After soldiers' departure, the tea workers returned to the factory and found the tea leaves dehydrated and turned black due to the soldiers' bodily warming. It was no longer possible to dry those leaves according to the regular method. Therefore, they dried those tea leaves over a pan wood fire. A tea made in this way looked black and had a smoky flavor. A Chinese market would not like this strange tea, and so the villagers sold those inferior tea at a very low price. To the locals' price, the smoky tea captured the British hearts and resulted in a pre-order of this tea for the following year at a price two to three times higher than normal. From then on, the locals specialized in producing this smoky tea for the foreign trade. Although this widely circulated story about the origin of Lapsang Xiaozhong was probably invented simply to reinforce the historic link between black tea and the British, it does reflect the general tea preference of the Chinese at that time. In earlier Chinese and English articles, I have summarized the evolution of the term Bohea over time. A black tea Bohea is now replaced by the name Lapsang Xiaozhong, Zhengshan Xiaozhong in Chinese. A table lists some early foreign explorers whose records and publications transmitted knowledge of Bohea to the Western world. A relatively unknown Frenchman, known by his pen name Old Nick, published an easy-to-read travelogue describing his travel to Bohea Hills and how the locals colored the tea leaves with chemicals. However, as he was not involved in the tea industry, his account has often been overlooked. Now let's turn our views of the trade settings, particularly Canton, where Chinese tea was shipped and where the adulteration of Bohea was commonly practiced. From 1757 to 1842, due to the Qing government's policy of banning maritime trade, Canton was the only port to remain open and deal with the foreign trade, known as the Canton system. The Chinese home merchants and the Western supercargoes were the two key roles representing the seller and the buyer during the period of the Canton system. Tea buyers had to learn the various process of producing tea from the Chinese brokers to develop their own capacity to assess the quality of the teas, and to carefully judge and select which knowledge had to be confined in China and which information should not be circulated beyond the cargo ship. They were not only learning passively, but were also engaged in producing and appreciation and knowledge of tea that were beneficial to tea companies and that had to be passed on to their consumers at home. This is a list of the price and the quantity of different teas purchased in Canton by the Dutch East India Company from 1754 to 1758. We can see that compared to the other 8 tea products imported from China, only the home order for Bohea was unrestricted and simply described as much as possible, while other teas all had a recommended amount each year. The English East India Company data also present a similar pattern. Around the middle 18th century, Bohea was the cheapest and most exported tea from Canton. This data from the 2 major Western import companies demonstrated that what attracted the Western tea buyers was its profitability rather than its quality. A tea business traditionally involved 5 steps: negotiation a contract, signing the contract, examine the tea samples, packing the teas, and loading and stowing the teas on the company's ships. Thus, fraud normally occurred when the tea was packed and loaded. Fraud could take place in the warehouses in Canton, where, for instance, there were 2 Boheas. One was Bohea from Bohea Hills. The other was Canton Bohea, which was an inferior mixture of leftover Canton mixed with a coarse tea called Wuping. Western tea traders too sometimes bought very cheap and low quality tea and blended it with Bohea, Canton, and Xiao teas. Most of the time, the tea leaves were crushed when loading at a port because the coolie's lack of concern and could never meet the quality described in the contract. A daily record of the loading process made by a supercargo on November 3rd, 1764 shows that during the packing stage, the coolies rammed the tea into the chests by rampling on it with their feet. Now we will shift to the 3rd stage, the sea travel. Let's have a look at the vessels for shipping teas. A picture on the left shows an old-style East India Company ship, while the image on the right shows a last tea clipper, the catsuck. Clippers were designed for speed and had a very thin hull that imposed a specific loading order. This picture shows the loading order of a clipper. Although Bohea is not highlighted in this picture, a Dutch East India Company documents show that porcelain was loaded at the bottom, followed by the Bohea. Bohea was also used to seal inside the porcelain and in the chests to protect the porcelain during sea travel. Similarly, the English East India Company put a large amount of Bohea on board at the ship to serve as a ballast, and later it was loaded to secure adequate flooring for the funnel teas. Another important reason explaining Bohea's popularity is its capacity to tolerate the long sea journey, preserving its strong taste, where the light flavor of green tea might disappear after several months of navigation. Finally, Bohea tea arrived in the UK. In the 18th century, the increasing supply of sugar resulting from the British colonial expansion in the Caribbean islands greatly stimulated the consumption of black tea. As the truly transcultural, cross-linguistic, and trans-regional commodity, Bohea was far more than a beverage from China. It was a product connected to the chinoiserie, aristocratic taste, and to the material embodiment of an Oriental lifestyle. A poem by Lord George Byron praising Bohea's virtue as below. I feel my heart become so sympathetic that I must have to recourse to black Bohea. Tepe's wine should be so deleterious, for tea and coffee leave us much more serious. But why it was Bohea the best-selling tea instead of other teas? During the 18th century, Bohea was one of the three kinds of tea generally available on the British market, alongside the two forms of green tea, Songlo and Imperial. Compared to them, Bohea had two obvious advantages. It better resisted to long sea journeys, and Bohea's robust leaves tolerated reheating and even repeatedly boiling. These advantages explain its commercial success, as it was much more affordable for ordinary consumers, including in the emerging working class. By the middle of the 19th century, teas from China had become more affordable, and tea consumption could spread from the upper class to millions of households. Meanwhile, related publications and guidebooks on Chinese tea consumption were put on the market. Sigmund's book, Tea, Its Effects, Medical and Moral, provided practical knowledge with detailed description of major tea commodities from China. Because Bohea was the most widely consumed tea at that time, he dedicated more pages to it than other teas. While admitting that the Chinese are tea consumers, he pointed out that Bohea was not widely consumed in China, where even the humbler classes did not purchase it. This clarification is consistent with the story of the origins of black tea, which stresses that this tea was not appreciated by the Chinese, but favored by the British. The popularity of Bohea was certainly not an accident as it is commonly claimed in China, but the result of a well-conceived promotional strategy that highlighted its superiority as an affordable and resilient brew for consumers. It is very hard. It's only one sentence.
Yeah, okay. That's okay. 5 more minutes can do.
Okay, it is very hard to specify what is authentical about Bohea, but its identity and significance have been variously constructed and have changed over time and space. Due to the geographical and linguistic separation between producers and consumers, screening and transmitting knowledge about Bohea were essential. The information that eventually reached the Western countries was carefully selected and allocated. Throughout the flow of Bohea, the taste seems to have been the least important factor. Okay, thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Kunbing. That was wonderful.
So I can stop sharing.
Sure, if that's what you prefer.
Yeah.
So we will open the floor up now for questions. We see that there are 3 questions already, it seems, in the Q&A box. Wonderful. All right, so we'll start with a question from Alan D. What are some tea samples from 1650 through 1850 that are still produced today using the same methods? Is one able to have the same tea experience from that period? And if so, how?
You mean the tea samples, the tea samples in the 17th century?
So are we still producing some of the teas that were made between 16th, like, you know, Bohea, Souchong, etc., etc.?
Yeah. In fact, I think those terms of the teas exchanged in the 17th and 18th century were very confusing for the modern consumers, because like Bohea, what I discovered from the book I quoted is that the black tea that, like Samuel Ball quoted, certainly was not the black tea processed in Bohea hills nowadays, but by contrast, it was oolong tea, rock tea. So, and the Bohea's connotation is changed, and the origin of Lapsan Xiaozhong, the earliest black tea, it is still mysterious. So even for some documentary, people still just quote the oral legend of the black tea, like I quoted in my presentation. So it is not very clear. And I think the Western explorers in the early stage, they were also very confused.
Yeah. And the notations then get confusing because, of course, they're noting different types of names, etc. And their knowledge of tea is still growing.
Yes.
So since we're on the subject of Bohea, there's a wonderful question about, do you know if there is an extant oldest specimen of Bohea kept in a Chinese museum? Is there such a specimen?
No, no, I don't think so.
All right. So that was short and simple. Let's get to Alistair Watt's question. What form of tea is the big red robe from Wuyi?
It's a rock tea. It's a rock tea, oolong tea.
Okay, so it is an oolong tea, as he's asked.
But I mean, nowadays people consider it as rock tea, oolong tea, and you can even visit the mother tree of the big red robe in the scenic spot, and that region, which at the present day only produce rock tea. But historically, we never know. But I think it was rock tea, oolong tea.
Terrific, thanks. What are the Chinese characters for Bohea?
Wuyi, Wuyi. It's
So
Wuyi tea, and the Bohea hills also called Wuyi Mountains, or Wuyi Shan in Chinese.
All right. So Lars Lammen, you have your answer there. Another question: are there any tea trade archives in Chinese public collections?
I would recommend that, in fact, the first version is not in Chinese, but it's translated into Chinese, and the author is a Chinese. But he published in English. The author is Liu Yong. He published the monography of the VOC, the Dutch East India Company's tea trade. It's a very good monography because he used the first-hand archive from the VOC.
All right, thanks. We have another question from Markman Ellis, who was our first speaker on the first day of this conference. I will read his comment and then ask the question that he's posed. Thank you so much, Kunbing. That was fascinating. I really like your suggestion that Bohea, as it was known to British importers and consumers in the early 18th century, was the product of an accident, subsequently exploited by the tea trade. Do you think this was considered and deliberate, or a function of the market and value flow?
I think it's the market. As I said, it's a market strategy. So, and of course, the market strategy. It depends on its materiality. As I said, because it has such a superiority. I don't know that. Is it satisfy your questions?
Then let's hope so. And maybe Markman can also email you and you can have an exchange about this as well. We have another question from Kelly, who's following up on your explanation about Bohea and oolong. And she says, does Bohea in the past refer then to tea produced in Wuyi? Does it refer to both oolong tea and black tea?
Yes, nowadays the Wuyi Mountains, they produce the oolong tea and the black tea, and the two regions are separated clearly, very clearly.
Okay. Linda has a question that actually taps into something I was thinking about Kunbing, as you mentioned Robert Fortune. Are there any Chinese texts about him?
The Chinese was translated by the English archives because because his records are in English. And nowadays, I think just a couple of years ago, 2 books about Robert Fortune and also his books, the original, his like 3 years in China, were translated in Chinese, and which aroused debate in China. He's still like a scholar in the tea world. Yeah, people, and particularly in Bohea Hills, people were still talking about him.
How interesting, even now.
Yes, people, but we don't have any record in Chinese. We have recourse to the English records.
I see. So even with the Hong merchants, there are no responses, let's say, to the European merchants in Chinese at all. A lot of this seems to be oral history then, is that it? Sort of handed down?
I think most of the archives are in English. I know there's some collections in the Kew Garden of Robert Fortune's collection, and the pictures, and even with some pictures are very impressive. I think he hired some Chinese painters to draw pictures for him.
Interesting. So we have a wonderful question from Catherine Burnett, who also presented yesterday on teapots, and she says, my understanding that Wuyi rock teas are prestigious and expensive, not cheap, and oolong teas, not black teas. Could you please comment?
This is really, this is a good question, but it goes back to the question, what is the origin of black tea? Because I found from the archives and the literatures I read, it's contradictory from the present phenomenon. Because yes, nowadays rock tea certainly is one of the most expensive teas in China. It is certainly the superior tea. But the Bohea in the 18th century, what I have found, all those lists of price were very low. So I just found there's a gap between the history and the present phenomenon. And I just found it very interesting for Samuel Ball's book, if you read Samuel Ball's book, because he had quite a few illustrations. And if you visit the Wuyi Mountains today, if you visit any rock tea factories, you will find those illustrations and the tools, instruments for making rock teas are exactly the same. Even the name, like the Beilong he mentioned, the name are also the same. So Samuel Ball's black tea certainly is, I think for me, it's oolong tea.
Very interesting. So we have a question from Victoria saying, I very much enjoyed guanyin tea. Is this type of Bohea as well?
No. It's produced in Anxi. But also in Fujian province, southern part of the Fujian province, not northern part of Fujian province. It's still oolong tea.
Okay. So I had a question as, someone who's an art historian and looking at your images today, and this has struck me in the past as well, that Chinese tea bushes are shown as quite small. They're almost at your knee length height. At least that's my impression. And this is very similar to the Darjeeling bush, which is not at knee length height, but it's interesting to see the scale of the bush in China versus in India. Any thoughts about that?
Oh, in fact, at the beginning, I used another illustration for Bohea tea. I think because you are more familiar with the black tea world in India and around, like Sri Lanka, that Bohea in the black tea world is completely different from the Chinese Bohea. It was the largest leaves. The lower part of the tea leaves are from a tea bushes. So the leaves are very big, and it's the grinding of the black tea. So it's a lower quality of black tea. And but in this connotation is only applied for the India tea and around the regions, not in China. So the connotation is really, it depends on the historical context and also regionally.
Got it. Okay, thanks. So we have Samir, who's asked a question about the difference between tea and tisane. So this is, Samir, this is a difference between, I guess, a brew from the Camellia sinensis plant, and then the tisane is really a herbal, where you're brewing from non-camellia species, essentially. So I don't know whether you can answer this question or not, Kunbing, but I'll ask anyways.
So what is the question?
The question is, would you call bamboo leaf green tea or tisane?
Oh, 竹叶青,竹叶青is the green tea produced in Sichuan.
Okay, so wonderful. So you did have the answer to the question. The other, let's see. Oh, we've got some more questions that came in. I was going to ask you something else, but this is fabulous. So Yana asks, how is green oolong called in Chinese versus black oolong?
Black oolong. Black oolong. The oolong tea is the oolong tea. Black tea is black tea. So,
okay.
So for me, there are two teas made. Yeah. As far as I know, there are two teas, black tea and oolong tea.
All right, so that answers Yana's question. And on to Alistair, who has another question for you. When in 2016, we visited the temple Fortune stayed at in the Wuyi Shan, we were told by a resident Buddhist priest that way back in the past, Fortune had made his visit there. Is this something that strikes a bell? Just a comment, I guess.
Yeah, I think, Fortune, I read his travelogue. Yes, he did meet some monks and spend some nights in the temples. It was very impressive for Chinese, yes.
Okay, so on from Fortune on to Mariana's question over here. Thank you for your presentation. I really appreciate having a bit of Chinese perspective into what the British and the general Western world consider an extraordinary thing, the tea trade. Do we have any sort of written reactions from the Chinese side about the craziness that this product produced? Was there any reaction about the interest in what was the cheapest tea available in China?
Historically, yes, I think Bohea is almost the cheapest, but still, as I mentioned, there's still a few cheaper one, and also a fraud of Bohea. They bought some even lower quality and fake Bohea, like in Canton. There's the authentic Bohea from Bohea Hills, and there's the Bohea produced in Wuping. So I think that Bohea was almost the cheapest tea on the official purchase list, possibly. And I think in the black market, you can always find some even lower quality of tea and blend it together, so that it's a commercial secret. It's commercial secret of blending, I think.
This is something that we haven't explored in this conference, is all of the fraudulent methods and the black market methods, etc. There's a whole underbelly to the tea trade that has existed since the beginning.
Like the historical, I said, there are 5 stages for to negotiate a contract, and and then you sign the contract, and then you check the tea samples. It's just the official order, not necessary. Those are always black market. You don't have to. Possibly, you can find some tea, suppliers illegally.
All right. So speaking of that, I'm going to allow. Let's see. I'll let Richard, my colleague, ask you the last question. He had his hand raised. So Richard, please go ahead.
Thank you.
Hi, Kunbing Xiao. Thank you so much for your talk. I really enjoyed it. And I was persuaded, among other things, by your argument about Bohea's resilience on board ship in terms of its flavor profile, and that being one of the explanations for why it might have been so popular, among other reasons, in England. But I wanted to sort of comment and ask you a bit more about the instability of the name Bohea in English and in Chinese, or about the kind of the instability or uncertainty of the label Bohea as a tea, because my impression is that in the early 18th century, even in the late 17th century in England, Bohea was quite a luxury commodity. It was something that was very desirable in England. People would pay quite a lot of money for Bohea. And by the end of the 18th century or the early 19th century, it referred to something, it had become quite a derogatory term really for black tea, even in England. It was a cheap black tea. And I wonder if you think that is about the fact that British consumers, their taste improved, they learned to appreciate tea over time? Or is it that the product changed, that what was being sold in England as Bohea in 1700 was different from what was Bohea in England by 1800? I hope you're still there.
I think Kunbing is frozen, yeah?
Might come back.
Yeah,
She
she
may
might come
return.
back. We have about a
I was
minute left for the video.
boring her with the length of my question, Rom, is the problem.
She's
Froze the
frozen
internet.
in time. You freeze, yeah. Well, I'll tell you what, Richard, why don't we have you, would you mind emailing Kunbing the questions so that we can stick to at least the time frame
Of
the
course, yeah.
conference? Yeah. But it was a great question. I want to know the answer as well, as I'm sure lots of other people on this call must. All right, so wonderful. Thanks, Richard, for your question, and to be continued behind the scenes, perhaps. So now we're going to move on to our first of the collection's videos we're screening today from Oak Spring Garden Foundation, which I think will really provide a wonderful background in some ways to what Kunbing discussed. Kunbing, hello again. We are segueing into the next, oops, we can't hear you. You're on mute. Can you unmute yourself? Okay, I think the video is still.
Okay.
All right.
Okay. I'm
Kunbing,
sorry, it's my
no
internet
worries,
connection.
no worries at all. What Richard will do is send you his question by email. So you can answer it perhaps behind the scenes because we'll move on now to our first.
I think I can answer by a simple sentence. Just
All right.
reply. Can
Super.
respond.
Yeah.
I think the fraud I presented in my talk also related to risk result, because the fraud happened, so it also ruined the reputation of Bohea. So as Richard suggested, the quality of Bohea was degraded as time goes by.
Interesting. Fabulous. Thank you, Kunbing. That was a wonderful presentation, and it really helped us rethink some of the paradigms that we've been discussing during this conference. So hope to see
I'm
this
really sorry
conversation
for my
continue.
internet.
Oh, no worries. I had problems the first day at my end as well. It's the world that we live in these days. So thanks for tuning in and for presenting a terrific.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
You're welcome. All right.
Possible. Okay.
Okay.
Maybe we can.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. See you.
Sure. See you
after
soon.
the break.